Welcome to the final panel, in which we try to take the discussions we had on this conference a bit further, look at research perspectives, and meeting again, hopefully. You may not be surprised to hear that what we are particularly interested in is situating our discussions in the context of the research group that has organized this conference, research group Law, Gender, and Collectivity. We will be starting our second funding period in July, so this is really a very nice time to look back on what we have achieved and look forward to what we will be researching still. We have organized this panel on interdisciplinary gleanings in 3 parts: law, gender, and collectivity. And each part intends to confront a contribution from one person from the research group, with the perspective of another colleague from another discipline and from outside of our small group. We have limited time for these 6 persons, so that's why we have decided to limit the discussion to the panelists. Whoever wants to discuss the issues with us, come to Wonder after the sessions. There will be more time than we have on the session itself. Let me introduce myself and my partner for this discussion. I'm a labor lawyer from European University Viadrina, Frankfurt Oder, which is about an hour from Berlin at the Polish-German border. I'm also a social legal scholar, and I have been taking part in this research group with a project on the ways gender has been used as a mobilizing and structuring factor in trade union campaigning. My partner for this discussion is Julia Eckert. She's a professor for political anthropology at the University of Bern in Switzerland. Her current research leads her to exploring the emergence of transnational legal norms, and she focuses particularly on changing institutions of responsibility and liability. She connects these with current contestations over democratic representation and participation, over security and citizenship. In the past, she has conducted ample field research, for example, in India, in Uzbekistan, in Afghanistan, and in Switzerland. And she used to work in Germany before joining the University of Bern. She was head of the research group Law Against the State at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Saale. And this was the research group that examined the juridification of protests, the transnationalization of legal norms. She's also one of the editors of the journal Anthropological Theory. So I'm very happy to be able to discuss with Julia the issues that we have been talking about in this conference. Well, let me first start by asking, what is the point of the law in the formation of collectivities? This is what we as a research group have ultimately been interested in. This will be our focus for the second funding period. We started our research with the observation that late modern societies, the ones that we're living in, are characterized by dynamic conflicts that challenge societal cohesion. And we asked if these conflicts can give rise and do give rise to the emergence and transformation of collectives that could become instances of new and inclusive forms of social communities. We have been looking for collectivities that could be seen as real experiments in which new forms of social solidarity and cohesion are explored. Well, the question would be, what could be the role of the law in such processes? Are we seeing anything like the law contributing to experiments for new forms of social solidarity? We have heard lots of great and interesting discussions on a great variety of interesting legal topics. And I want to start with one of the issues we have been talking about, which is the issue of legal categorization. Obviously, legal categorization is something that happens within the law, within the legal system, and it's rather a puzzle how this legal categorization can create something beyond the law and beyond the law's idea of the general, which, as we all know, hides social power and social differentiation behind the veil of neutrality. So how can legal categorization really contribute to something beyond the law, creating groups that are not only separated from each other? Particularly in the session of today, we have seen with Fiona Schmidt's research, Rainer Mühlhoff's research before, that the law does exclude by using its veil of neutrality, and legal institutions, police forces as an example, hide behind the veil of neutrality. So this is a function of the law that rather inhibits creation of new and inclusive communities. We have also heard many examples where the law is used by groups, by people that are not professional lawyers, or where law is put in the service of resistance against power, in the service of social movements. This is due to the promises of the law, to the normative aspects of the law that is always incorporated in the law, these ideas of equality, freedom, and solidarity that are still connected with normative and legal ideas. And if we look at communities and collectives, what is particularly interesting is how social groups use these categorizations the law offers. Cornelia Kocher showed how these terms in European human rights law have been used by groups in order to fight and counter discrimination. Eventually, in these processes, some of the new ideas for inclusive forms of the law may become incorporated in the law. And critical and feminist lawyers have been constantly working on concepts of how a more inclusive version of collectivity within the law might look like. Maria Sagmeister gave an interesting example of how labor law could be constructed in a new way, so as to give new ideas of working together, of incorporating working life with care responsibilities. This is something that we as critical and feminist lawyers have always been working on, but it's still work that is done within the law, which comes from the ideas and the perspective and the actions and litigations by social movements, but which needs some translating into the law in order to become effective in the law. But what does this tell us about new collectivities, new forms of social solidarity and cohesion? Interestingly, it is the procedures of the law and the law as an instrument that can also be an instrument for creating processes that reflexively work with the law and create a coming together of persons with different perspectives on the law. Lisa Hahn has used the term of litigation collective in order to capture these collectivizing processes of the use of the law. She proposed not talking generally about strategic litigation, because what interested her and what is interesting to us as well is not the strategic aspect of it. This is something that's in the back of it all. But what we are interested in is the processes that have been evolving in the group of persons working with the law, against the law, and in the use of the law. So that's why she proposes using the term of litigation collective. So this is one of the examples that we have discussed here. We haven't had enough time to go further but I hope we will have more time to discuss in our research group in the second funding period, and maybe in another instance on another conference. I also wanted to point about some research that a colleague of mine, Isabel Hensel, has been doing in the context of this research group. It was a research on trade union campaigning, where she looked for instances where social actors and social movements did not use the law as something that is a point, a fixed idea, which could be changed, but ways in which social movements use the discussions that are taking place inside the law, reflexively representing those complex discussions that lawyers bring forward in the social movements, using the law not as something that is fixed and hard, but using the law as something that is soft and always changing in a process of discussion. These are the discussions we will continue in the next 3 years. And hopefully we will have another conference in 3 years' time in order to discuss our results with all of you. But first, there's some time to discuss this on our small panel. And I give the floor to Julia Eckert. Eckert, Julia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thank you for posing these really central questions on how legal categorization can create something beyond groups that are separated from each other, beyond the idea of the general that hides social power behind the veil of neutrality. I think this is indeed still the central question, and so much of our critiques of the resort to law, particularly by less powerful groups, social movements, individuals, have focused on, precisely those individualizing or essentializing and depoliticizing effects of what I, in my previous research also, or even the current one, called the juridification of social struggles. And I was, in a way, really delighted that I heard during this conference that you found quite some evidence for all this not being so clear-cut, and that, to take up Susanne Beer's question of what law is really like, it doesn't seem to be like that necessarily, namely individualizing, essentializing, and in a way hiding power in that way, and that it can be otherwise. So I found also the insights by Cornelia Klocker really interesting, but particularly her call to investigate more closely these linguistic negotiations over the meaning of categories and groups and communities, really important. Or the reimagination of the norm that Maria Sackmaster mentioned yesterday as well. All these relate a little bit to ideas of how legal change of legal norms can be sort of thought and spoken into being, and who the actors are who can do that. It seemed to me, although at the same time, that while you have found a lot of evidence for example, the individualization that is attributed to law not being impossible to overcome, because law does provide also the conceptual grounds for collective concerns, and even for law to found sort of unexpected alliances. but that there is less evidence in your studies of law supporting solidarities across diverse categories, or even dissolving the boundaries of categories as such, to give them a more processual and inclusive character. So that it seems that in such struggles over the meaning of legal categories and norms, nuances change, and maybe the particular content, but the basic separating structure of categorization remains. So in a way, I would like to emphasize the question that Eva Kocher just also posed, how such new legal forms that you all addressed also can be saved from creating new exclusions. But I would actually venture the thesis that we can observe also this, and in particularly in fields where struggles, social movements employ legal instruments in new ways. And by this, I mean in ways that are not really meant for them by sort of textbook or lawyer's law, in creative ways. And this is something that I also think happens often in what Lisa Hahn discussed, strategic litigation, maybe a little bit more in the strategic aspect of it, rather than in the building of collectivities around or within such strategic litigation efforts. Because there, I think what happens is really to bring forward new interpretations by strategic misunderstandings or lay misunderstandings of given meanings or established meanings of legal norms and categories to create new meanings and new possibilities. And I think what often happens here is that claimants, plaintiffs, and their allies in these litigation collectives perceive themselves in situations that are comparable to those of others and shaped by similar forces. And they purport that if a norm applies to one case somewhere in the world, a situation deemed the same should be treated the same. And I think here there is this underlying perception of commonality, of shared concerns, of shared problems, of shared forces that can be the basis also of solidarities across different categories and across the groups constituted by legal categories. The assertion in such processes is that my particular situation is similar to your particularity in relation to a general norm provided by law. And that the generality or the universality of that norm is actually sort of thought and spoken into being, ignoring in these cases often what Marilyn Strathern has called the cuts between different fields of law, between different jurisdictions and different fields of regulation. So any assertion of comparability between different situations and different struggles is always also assertion of commonality, and that commonality including difference. And I think what makes this possible is not only the claim to equality inherent in law that you, Eva Kocher, just mentioned. I do agree that this is a very important promise which propels a powerful dynamic by social struggles that mobilize law, but that there is also a second, more modest aspect of law that brings this fundamental comparability and thereby also the assertion of commonality about. And that is that law perceives difference as particularity. And particularity is always founded in commonality. To speak of what is particular is to assume that there is also something that is shared. And I'm making this point because I think, or rather maybe I fear, that this aspect of law, of seeing the particular and thereby also the common is losing ground, and that there is a new logic and law emerging that disables such solidarities that are founded on the operation my particularity is similar to yours in relation to a specific problem. So while today some of the aspects that we have hitherto thought to inhibit and prevent solidarities and alliances in liberal law, namely the individualization and essentialization inherent in it, seem to be possibly overcome by the practices of mobilizing law, as so many of you have shown. And because there are aspects in law that support other ways of both building collectivities and finding commonality amongst collectivities, I think then it might be very useful to pose the question in the context of this discussion and for your future research, whether we can actually observe new tendencies in law that inhibit solidarities to emerge in new ways. I mean, I think one agreement in your whole discussion is that what the law is and how it operates is highly historical and is shaped by specific historical constellations and antagonistic historical struggles. And so when talking about the inhibition of solidarities to emerge within law or with law, one of course needs to think also of potential new problems for solidarities to come about. And one of those I see currently in law kind of increasingly turning its attention away from the particular in the general or in the common and towards the singular. It is a distinction I take from Heinz Bude, actually, but he didn't apply it to law. But in my research on transnational legal studies or transnational legal struggles that cross many different jurisdictions, I see this new logic to emerge, particularly in relation to the increasing use of procedures such as arbitration, out-of-court settlement, and alternative dispute resolution, which of course are all assumed to be beneficial to the weaker parties in a conflict in highly asymmetrical disputes. I see it also in courts and the preferences of judges to actually focus not so much on the particular and how it relates to a general norm, but to focus on the unique and singular circumstances of a single incident and the unique constellation of parties concerned, and which enables the not to find a solution according to a general norm, but an agreement between the particular people involved or the particular parties involved, which has its benefits, but it also, I think, might be a means of preventing solidarities across such incidents and across different struggles, because any comparability, any precedent, any references to shared concerns is actually made irrelevant thereby. Now the question is whether this focus on the singular, on the singularity, actually isolates cases from each other and thereby inhibits and prevents solidarities to emerge and single cases being part of a larger social struggle, or whether it also might have the potential to make legal categories less relevant and thereby reflect more adequately on the openness and fluidity, the processual character of social formations. I'm skeptical. I feel that here we have a new logic in legal practice in courts and tribunals emerging, which is detrimental to larger solidarities to take shape and to last. But what I want to say really is more generally that there might be other such new inhibitions of solidarities in law that we should focus on, and that we should find now that social movements have found ways to employ law also to found their solidarities in. Yes, I think this is what I wanted to say, and I'm very curious what Eva Kocher thinks of these suspicions that I have voiced here.
Thank you very much, Julia. That's really an issue I have been also very concerned with. I'm not sure if it's really very new, because Max Weber was already concerned with this aspect of legal procedures, only considering what you named the singular instead of the particular in relation to the general. So it may be not so new at all, but it is a very important concern. And I see this as something that we could discuss in discussing critiques of the law that have been very prominently discussed for the last years. And these critiques, modern critiques of the law, they often say, well, the law has to be situated in the society. It has to become more fluid and more open to society, more political, more situated into conflicts. And I wonder what this means. I know that critiques of the law often situate these perspectives as perspectives outside of the system we are living in. So it would be a rather utopian perspective. But there is a danger inherent in these ideas, because they lead us away from what is some of the appeal of the law. Its relationship with power. Its relationship with power and the general. The law always represents the general in a way. It represents not always the state. In transnational aspects, it wouldn't be the state, but a general idea. That's how I understood your idea of the particular in relation to the general. And that has a lot to do with the law's very intimate relationship to power. And if we renunciate, if we do not use these powers and rather situate the law out in society, we have to find new forms that establish, that prevent the danger of dissolving into singular aspects, open conflicts that are maybe not resolved at the end. So I think this danger that you mentioned should be kept in mind when we are critiquing the law and its close relationship with power. But I also wanted to, as a last aspect in our talk, which I would also present to you, Julia, as one last aspect, that is concepts for conceptualizing the common, the particular, maybe in relation to the general, which could look at not only the differences between us all, but also at commonalities. And that's the concept of intersectionality. And the ideas that approach intersectionality, not necessarily from an anti-discrimination point of view, but from a view that analyzes specific situations and looks at how these represent powers and structures and how they could be represented in an inclusive way. I remember Maria Sagmeister's idea that we discussed yesterday, and we discussed the idea if it is really the mother or the single parent, or maybe an even opener concept. And I know that Petra Sussner, for example, she has been working on the idea of vulnerability as a concept that could represent ideas of intersectionality in a way that could be productive in this sense. So we do not have very much time left, but I would like to give the word to Julia for a short answer before then giving over the floor to Martin and Elisabeth.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. I think intersectionality, of course, is one way of addressing the deep entanglement which of each of us all together, which constitutes also the commonality. The inseparability of our particularities. I would say yes. This is a productive concept to address this, to not misunderstand commonality as sameness, which it doesn't mean. It means sharing a certain situation in different positions. And I think this is what intersectionality addresses. So I'm not quite sure what your question was, whether I'm supposed to provide the concept now, but it is definitely something I think I would think it might need, this commonality might need more theorization than the term intersectionality, which has its specific uses for us, would describe. I think they are not identical, and so they both have their value, and the commonality needs to be theorized in a broader sense even. This is not really a very good answer, but at this moment I cannot come up with a better one.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to hear some different ideas on this. We will be talking about this 3 more years at least. And we have been inviting you before to one of our sessions. So I hope we can continue this in the future and in the future 3 years. But now we want to discuss the meaning of gender in this, in our research endeavor and this conference. So Martin Lücke will be introducing into these subjects.
Yes, thank you, Eva and Julia, for your very interesting discussion. My name is Martin Lücke. I'm a professor for history education at Freie Universität Berlin, and I'm part of this really exciting research group. And it's our task now to talk about gender, its relevance and its value for our research project in its first and maybe in its second phase, and as a category to reflect on the results of this conference. My partner of discussion is Elisabeth Holzleithner. She's a professor for legal philosophy and legal gender studies at the University of Vienna. She's working on many fields in the intersection of law and gender studies, especially on human rights in the European context and on legal aspects of sexual harassment. A very influential publication is her book on justice, in German Gerechtigkeit, which is a great pleasure to read. In 2017, she has been awarded, among many other distinctions, with the Gabriele Posana State Award for Scientific Achievements in Gender Research granted by the Ministry of Education, Science and Research in Austria. So, dear Elisabeth, it's a great pleasure for me to have this short discussion with you. And in a first impulse, I may give my perspective on the use and the necessity of gender in our research group and as a category to reflect on this conference. And afterwards, I will give the word to you, Elisabeth. And I'm sure we will have a short but very exciting discussion afterwards. So my view is that of a historian. My main interest is to point out how gender is a stimulus of change and how changing societies, and societies are always changing, deal with gender. In the first period of our research group, we were interested to find out how law provides the opportunity to change gender constructions and gender relationships, always considering the intersectional relations of gender. We were especially interested in conflictuous constellations in which the possibilities of change, the ability of transformation, got into conflict with persistence, continuity, with lengthiness and stolidness. And these conflictuous situations, possibilities of change and the ability of transformation on the one hand, and persistence, continuity and lengthiness on the other hand, can be related to law and can be related to gender. Both categories can be slow-moving or fast-running categories. And they cannot just be slow-moving or fast-running categories. They can also be oppressive or liberating. Susanne Baer on Wednesday talked about the oppressive power of law. Law can also be liberating, and I think we all know that applies to gender as well. Gender as a category can be oppressive and also liberating. At the example of the German homosexual emancipation movement, we could see that at least in Germany, two very slow changes concerning law and gender interfered. The idea that law has to protect a general object of legal protection. In German, we say zu schützendes Rechtsgut, general object of legal protection, which could be called morality, or in German, allgemeine Sittlichkeit, slowly changed into the idea that sexual self-determination might be the relevant object of legal protection. The shift in the concept of this object of legal protection might be somehow a roadmap on the long way to a decriminalization of male homosexuality in Germany. And as historians, we always have to be aware of the idea that such a roadmap is very helpful to write history, but that we never just replicate our Western master narrative of gender progress, for example. But gender, I think, here became evident as a category which almost par excellence refers to the definition of gender by Reverend Connell as a category that, quote, centers on the reproductive arena, end quote, as law initially seems to protect a natural and biological order of reproduction, but then is shifting more and more from an object of criminal law to an object of human right. But we always have to be aware of the fact that that's not a new master narrative, but that might be idea to construct the sources and the ideas of gender and law which are on the way of our research. In the second phase of our research group, we are looking for conflicts of gender in the area, which arise if an old general is contested and is shifting towards a new, aspired, sometimes utopistically transfigured new common, and how this new common quickly looks like an old general again. The mode in which the conflicts between an old general and a new common are carried out might be talking about a crisis of gender. As a gender historian, I know that nearly always when a crisis in relation to gender is exclaimed, this can be interpreted as a conservative strategy of a reauthorization of gender. In Germany, we call this Resouveränisierungsstrategie. There has been much research on that. Always when we are talking of crisis of gender, it often is a quite conservative matter of fact we are talking about. So this reauthorization of gender, this talking of a crisis of gender, might be something like an hold on of the old general. And talking of crisis is performed as a somehow beweeping of the old general in order to prohibit a new common. It's a mode of the persistence of gender, maybe. an old general and at once a new common in the interrelation of sexuality and gender seems to be the concept of queer, a concept which is a hard-earned concept by political movements and in academia, drafted as a utopian new common, but by now criticized as a, well, maybe old general by some. In our research group, we are able to historicize queer, and if a concept is historicized, its fundamental perishability, I think, gets visible. But what will be the new common of gender and sexuality beyond queer? This at least is a very open question, and maybe we can find answers for this question in our research group. Some of the ideas and questions have been discussed in the panels during this conference. We, for example, have heard that lesbian and gay desires of remembering the past appear as divided and even conflicting memories. The search for a new common here seems to be very controversial and powerful, even within the LGBTIQ community. So at least this LGBTIQ community is not the new common everyone is seeking for. And maybe here we hear the old desperate story of old white men bereaping a world in which gay men were the unrivaled victims, for example, of National Socialism. At least queer as a new common might give us answers for shaping a memory culture in which we are aware of the differences and commonalities of, well, at least lesbian and gays, and integrating other sexual identities as well. We also have heard in this conference on conflicts of queer politics, on ideas of sexual liberation, and of new ideas of queer collectivity. I'm at least a little bit skeptical if the phrases collectivity and queer quite well fit together. I learned in German the phrase queer heißt niemals wir. Queer never means we. So queer never is a category which might be possible for doing collectivization. I'm not sure. Maybe we find some evidence in our research group to make up our mind about the evidence of queer as a mode for new collectivities. So these are just some thoughts concerning gender and its value for our research. Now I'm very curious, Elisabeth, to hear your ideas, and welcome on our panel.
Well, thank you, Martin, for your thought-provoking speech, and also, of course, for inviting me, for having me at this fascinating conference. Gender has come a long way. It started out as a dichotomy, that of the male and female sex, loaded with meaning surrounding reproduction, as you pointed out. This natural fact was also morally and religiously charged, and it was considered the law's holy duty to keep conventional gender relations intact. These gender relations were, of course, also intimately tied to heterosexual orientation. The Austrian High Court once summarized this as the heterosexual orientation of the legally ordered society. That was in the 1970s, and I think it was a pornography case. A lot has changed, to put it mildly. A rapid development has taken place in recent decades, and I think that you summed it up really excellently by saying that gender went from being an issue of the criminal law to being an issue of human rights. This rapid development encompasses gender relations in their entirety. This includes not only the legal gender status, now with the possibility of having the legal gender status of diverse or of leaving the legal gender status open, but also the possibility of legally and institutionally recognizing relationships regardless of the gender of the two partners. Austria and Germany, as we all know, have opened marriage to same-sex couples within a short period of time. And fighting for marriage equality, while certainly a post-conventional legal success story, has not met with unambiguous enthusiasm. It has been highly criticized by conservatives on the one hand and queer avant-gardes on the other. The conservative camp fights for the conventional gender order, whereas the queer camp fights against the conventionalization of gay and lesbian lives and criticizes this as a turn toward homonormativity. The new common is contested indeed, and any new common will be contested anytime. The expansion of legal relations of recognition can be reconstructed as a process of emancipation through law. And here I also want to take up one of your threads. Indeed, I also believe that the power of law may not only be oppressive, but liberating. It can be used in an emancipatory sense. Law, and I think that is the task of the law in our post-conventional societies. Law has the task of enabling equal freedom in the sense of a legally guaranteed individual development and individual flourishing in relation with others. Theoretically speaking, gender has developed from a natural, morally charged fact to being considered as a web of norms. So I take gender to have taken a normative turn. It consists not only of the conventional versions of male and female, but also of transgender, intergender, non-binary, and other versions of gendered or even ungendered being. I prefer to speak of gender performances in order to emphasize that gender is not an ontological given, but consists of performances undertaken in webs of legal, social, moral, religious norms. Beyond essentialist constrictions, gender is to be seen as a physical and mental entity, as a process of unfolding one's own corporeality, accompanied by individual identifications. So gender is less a material given than a network of norms. Within this framework, recognition for individual gendered modes of existence or individual gender performances is granted and sometimes denied. There are manifold demands, so that the manifold demands of these norms engage people in their gendered performances. People negotiate these norms and integrate them into their behavior, either in dissociation from these norms or by appropriating them. Coming to the end of my short remarks, gender norms are, of course, traversed by other norms from other axes of power, such as race, ethnicity, religion, disability, etc. Gender is intersectional. And this basic insight needs to be integrated into any examination of gender as a complex web of norms. And this, as I gather, is also something that you are very aware of in your own research. And this brings me to the notion of queer, which you have referred to by the end of your remarks. And I remember that particularly at the beginnings of its use, this umbrella term of queer was supposed to integrate all these elements, actually. But it seems to me that the caravan has moved on, the activist caravan, but also in a way, probably the academic caravan. So I'm wondering whether queer is still the term for our time, even though I still use it to describe my own research field. When I'm asked to pin down what I'm working on, I always write, I'm doing legal gender and queer studies. So I'm still using the term, but it seems to me that this is something academic, and even academically, it's already coming out of fashion. It seems to me that the acronyms have taken over. The identity acronym of LGBTIQQA, depending on how many Buchstaben you want to use on the one hand, and the phenomena acronym SOGIESC on the other. I find myself using the acronym SOGIESC more and more because it is open not only to marginalized, but also to normalized ways of living sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions, and sex characteristics. This is what SOGIESC stands for. And this, I believe, is in itself a necessary and fruitful deconstruction. Gender identity, for instance, is not something that only those have who deviate from the norm, such as transgender or intergender or NBs. And of course, the norm is manifold, but every person has a gender identity. And one last point I want to make, when I'm bringing in these more conventional forms of gender identities or of anything under the umbrella of SOGIESC, I think we need to remember that also conventional gender norms are for many people a valid offering when it comes to living their own lives. Of course, taking up these offerings should not lead to devaluating the life choices of others. But it's not only the avant-gardes who have the right to celebrate their SOGIESCs. So thanks for giving me the time for my thoughts, and I'm very curious as to what you're going to say.
Yes, thank you very much, Elisabeth. I very much liked two of your ideas. You said if we see that gender is a network of norms, is a web of norms, I think this very well fits to the idea of looking at law as a special idea of making norms in society, in the state, or even if we look at human rights in transnational settings. So gender as a web of norms very well fits to our idea to look at law, gender, and collectivity. And I think we both agree in the point that that there's a shift from criminalization to human rights. I, as a historian, am a little bit afraid that this will lead to the old question of making a master narrative to current progress, so that we say, well, it's a very good idea that now issues of gender, of sexuality are dealt in issues of human rights, and I'm not sure if it is possible then, and I want to hear your opinion on that, if it is possible then to have a critical idea of how gender is dealt in our current times. If we say, well, it goes to human rights, how will it be possible to do a critique on human rights? And you are much more the expert of human rights than I am. So that would be interesting for me to hear, well, how we can break these master narratives. And well, the other thing is, I think we agree what you said about queer, that the career moves on, and that we all have the impression that there will be something beyond queer, and maybe that the time beyond queer has already started. We don't have a word for that yet. Maybe we don't need a word for that yet. And as you said, the single letters in LGBTIQ and star and so on get longer and longer, but what might really come after queer? Because maybe we are in a time where it's important to defend queer. At least in Germany, the discussions on the law of sexual identity, of gender and sexual identities in the last month were very conservative. And if we are now losing in academia and in our social movements, well, queer as an anchor point, I think that might be dangerous as well, that we don't have a new concept for working against conservative approaches of gender.
A lot of food for thought, which you have given me now. Let me start with the first kind of question that you have posed, namely the issue of the master narrative and whether we fall into an all too simple idea of progress, and how do we deal with this kind of approach that very often comes across pretty self-congratulatory, Eurocentric, and might even be considered quite imperialistic. I'm wondering whether it's possible to completely escape the notion of progress, and I'm saying this from my own life experience. Austria is a country where we had a criminal law against same-sex fornication until the year of 2002. As I was myself active in the, as we at the time called it, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender movement, of course, this was a situation which we unanimously considered as pretty bad. It's a bad situation if you have a criminal law that hangs as a Damocles sword over the lives of gay men, and that in a way taints all same-sex sexual relations, because it includes a message to the populace that being gay, that being lesbian is not something that is being wished for in this democracy. So I would characterize this as an unfortunate and yes, legally and morally bad situation that had to be overcome. And having overcome something invites us to use the notion of progress. Now, I would ask all of us not to use this notion as self-congratulatory, and not consider us as the gender avant-garde to have kind of the role of a messiah that brings the light to the people. But on the other hand, there was something to win. And now in a situation where ethno-nationalist movements get pretty strong, there is something to lose. And this, I think, is something we should and have to integrate into our work. That considering the possibility of flourishing in one's own identity, sexually and with regard to gender, is of worth, and that it's worth fighting for to be able to do that under the premise of equal freedom that is, I think, internal to our democracies. So those would be my thoughts to your first remark. And the other one is, I wonder if we need the notion of queer to do what we are doing, namely critical examining gender norms and wondering on what kinds of norms, legally speaking, we can agree in order to enable us to live freely and without harassment, without violence, in the gender expressions, the gender identifications we choose. I think it's not so important that we use the notion of queer. It's rather the question of what we are doing when we are doing critical gender theory. And maybe this is how I would call it, even critical gender theory, encompassing, of course, also critical sexual orientation theory, and including all the other axes of power which come in under the banner of intersectionality. Okay.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. Maybe we can can go on for 2 or 3 minutes with our discussion, because I think it's very interesting. I think what seems to be important for me, that at least if we are looking at gender as an issue of human rights or as a European issue, I think in current politics, policies, if we go back to national discussions, that might be a very difficult thing for this, what I've called a crisis of gender, calling out a crisis of gender and giving gender back to the national law system. So I think that is not a question, but maybe a hope also that if it is, if we will succeed in giving legislation of gender, of sexual orientation, maybe to transnational, as a transnational task, as a task of human rights, I think that might be an idea to stay in this. You told me I should not use the word progress, so it's very difficult to find a word for this now. To keep the state of the art.
Actually, I thought that you were wary of the notion of progress.
Yes, but as a historian, it's such a nice phrase.
Yeah.
Well, but maybe my really last question for you: do you think it is naive if I say it's a very good idea to give issues of gender to a transnational level, or is it dangerous maybe as well?
I think it really depends on how we do it. And I'm using the notion we now because I guess we both are involved in these transnational discussions. And I think a good place to start are actually the Yogyakarta principles that try to kind of show what we can already achieve in the current system of human rights, in how far the current system of human rights that does not include gender rights or rights of sexual orientation, in how far it already opens up spaces for people to flourish in marginalized sexual orientations or gender identities. And that I believe might be a good place to start, and also one of an attitude of humbleness and not of self-congratulatoriness, because I mean that we are now in this situation where we are, that the law of gender status has become pretty open, though it still is not constructed in a way that I would wish in the light of the principle of equal freedom. The same holds for transgender rights, where the situation in Germany is wanting in many respects. Yeah. So I think we have reason to be glad that we made big steps forward, and now you see I'm also in the paradigm of progress again. But this needs to be seen in the light of that we had to fight for that, and of course we have to continue fighting for these rights in a time when ethno-nationalist discourse is running rampant, and the very notion of gender that we use so fluidly and easily is nowadays under attack as gender ideology by Marxist ideologists that are running wild and are trying to destroy our gender order. And this is something which very much takes place in Western societies at the moment. So I think we have every reason to remain utterly vigilant and to try to lead a sensitive transnational conversation when it comes to realizing human rights in the realm of Sobiesk.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for this exciting discussion. It really has been too short, but nevertheless, we have to give the floor to Hanna Meißner and Eddie Bruce-Jones, and we are very curious to hear your discussion.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Martin and Elisabeth. We now come to our third core notion, the collectivity, which I have the pleasure of discussing with Eddie Bruce-Jones. Eddie Bruce-Jones is head of the Department of Law and Dean of the School of Law at Birkbeck College, University of London. His research and writing focuses on migration, racism, sexuality, colonialism, state violence, and citizenship. And out of his list of publications, I'd like to single out his important book, Race in the Shadow of Law, State Violence in Contemporary Europe. Thank you very much, Eddie, for joining us for the discussion today. My name is Hanna Meißner. I'm involved in the research group in the sub-project Reinventing Collectivity and Investigation of Discourses and Practices of Urban Co-housing. And I will start our little exchange with some reflections on questions that the notion of collectivity, as we approach it in our research, in our sub-project, but also in the research group, has raised, and questions that have also emerged in diverse ways during this conference. I sometimes had the impression that it's one of the most currently used categories of ours, collectivity, but the least defined maybe among the three. And I'm, as a sociologist and a feminist theorist, I would say that collectivity is the main focus of my research. It's social life, individuals in their social relations. It's my bread and butter, so to speak. However, collectivity is not actually a sociological key term. Technical, theoretical terms in sociology are society, nation, nation-state, organization, group, family, social movements. So these terms denote specific historical formations of collectivity with particular qualities of connections. And in this regard, collectivity functions as a sort of a generic term which denotes any kind of association of people. Many people together are a collectivity. And this, in a way, is how we, I think, in this research have been using this term, looking at diverse constellations of people brought together either by their own perception of commonality and aspirations, or by external attribution, for instance, through legal frameworks. And we have been applying different terms rather loosely also in this conference, but also in this discussion, in this session so far. We've been talking about groups, communities, organizations. And my question, of course, as a sociologist is, what happens if we take a closer look and try to define and distinguish between different kinds of collectivities? Now, classical German sociology traditionally distinguishes between two general prototypes of collectivity, Gemeinschaft, community, and Gesellschaft, society. And this, I think this binary setup has been consequential for theoretical approaches to collectivity. And I think we are still very much working with, in, and against this legacy of this binary conceptualization of collectivity. The distinction of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft implies an idea of progress. We heard a lot about progress just before now, and I think there's inherently an idea of progress in this distinction of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, the idea of progress toward modern society, and at the same time a loss of supposedly given archaic relations. A central feature for the progress toward modern society is generally understood as a process of individualization, which is understood as a liberation of the individual from the ties of so-called traditional dependencies. This idea of individualization as progress has always been accompanied by a certain nostalgia, the idea that through processes of individualization imply processes of loss, of connections, of ties. But until the early 1990s, I would say, at least in the mainstream of German sociology, individualization had mostly positive connotations, such as pluralization of lifestyles and gain of individual autonomy. In the last decades, however, there has been an increasing focus on effects of disintegration, fragmentation, and precarious living conditions. Individualization now has more problematic connotations of privatized responsibilities, overburdened individuals, and loss of social cohesion. And I think this is one of the points of entry of our research group when we say that our assumption is that social conflicts in late modern societies, and this maybe is the core of the social conflicts of late modern society, they are often framed as loss of social cohesion, problematic aspects of individualization and privatization of responsibilities. And the assumption of our research group is that social conflicts in late modern societies influence and induce new forms and formations of collectivity, and that these new collectivities can be seen as driving forces in renegotiating community, commonality, common good, and solidarity. Our notion of collectivity thus refers to associations based on common aspirations or common goals, and collectivity in this sense is not given, it is manufactured, and this manufacturing is an ongoing process. With regard to this, I'd like to raise 2 points. The first point is the observation that debates about new forms of collectivity are often accompanied by a disclaimer or by a note of caution. Let's not romanticize. We've been looking a lot also into new debates about commons, and this is a typical reaction. It's interesting new forms of collectivity, of community, but careful, let's not romanticize. There's a certain suspicion of nostalgia, of a longing for the impossible return to forms of sociality that are imagined as pre-modern. There's a ghost of sociality characterized by social control, personal dependency, and parochialism that often goes along with notions of commons, community, and so on. In a way, from the perspective of individualized subjects, collectivity appears to always be in tension with or even opposition to individuality. There's a certain zero-sum logic going on here, I think, where more collectivity equals less individuality and vice versa. In our research group, we address this tension of collectivity and individuality by focusing on the co-constitution of collectivity and subjectivation, with particular attention to their structuring through law and gender. I think, however, that it is useful to take a closer look at deeply ingrained, mostly tacit assumptions that individuality ultimately has to be protected from overbearing collectivity. In our sub-project on co-housing communities, we find traces of this assumption in the recurring declaration that it is crucial to find and uphold a balance between the individual and the community. The claim is that there are limits to what a community can demand of an individual. And this limit is negotiated in the community, but ultimately, this is the discourse in our housing community setup. The limit of what the community can demand from the individual, it is the individual who decides ultimately where this limit is. And this is, of course, a very liberating idea, that the community cannot decide for the individual how much he or she would like to bring in, but it is an interesting idea. In academic debates on new forms of community, this is echoed by cautionary notes that new forms of community often function as stopgaps for a neoliberal welfare state and go along with new forms of personalized dependencies that remoralize interdependencies at the expense of individual social rights. I'm interested in a deeper understanding of how these problematizations are shaped and confined by a binary zero-sum logic. Particularly, it seems important to take into account feminist insights on how binary gender relations have configured the foundational dualism of market-orientated, contract-based relations as the realm of individualism on the one hand, and responsibility for the necessities of care based on familial relations and emotional attachments. And here, I would say that the idea that gender is a web of norms has to always include the materialization of this web of norms in specific constellations that are more material or tougher or harder than the web of norms that may change and may the dualism of gender norms may change and may be queered and may be loosened, but some of this foundational dualism of individualism, contract-based, market-orientated on the one hand, and the question of these responsibilities for necessities that are beyond individual decision. We cannot, at a certain point in care relations, there's no point of decision making, I think, in an individual sense. And how this binary setup is still connected to gender norms. I'll leave this hanging here to go on to my second point, reflecting on how collectivities forming in response to conflicts in late modern societies can be situated in a tension of depoliticizing and repoliticizing these conflicts. The question is collective agency focused on enforcing given individual entitlement to belonging and participation, or is it focused on changing the conditions and thus ultimately changing the very formation of entitlement, of belonging, participation? Or is both happening simultaneously? Or under which conditions can both happen simultaneously? For instance, in our sub-project on co-housing, we found a discursive formation of co-housing communities as collectivities of individualized resourceful subjects who decide to pool their individual resources in order to better organize their living conditions, and also maybe to optimize their individual resources by pooling them. It is repeatedly stated by actors in the field that there are necessary limits to the sharing of individual resources. It is also repeatedly stated that these co-housing communities do not aspire to social transformation. And this becomes particularly clear in the staunch indifference to the question of legal ownership, which is framed as a choice to be made by individual communities. The notion is that there's a range of choices, whether a community takes the legal form of, say, a cooperative, or rather chooses the form of owner-occupied flats. This is staged as a pragmatic decision without relevance to society at large. And this kind of indifference to legal ownership is in contrast to recent developments of movements striving to politicize and to reconfigure the conditions of, and specifically the access to housing. We see this currently in Berlin, in particular with the campaign to the socialization of large housing companies, the Deutsche Wohnen und Co. Enteignen campaign, which specifically addresses the question of legal ownership of housing as a fundamental condition for access to housing, but also for the possibility of collectively, democratically shaping what housing is as a collective good and infrastructure, and thus also the question what living in houses actually means, what it means to inhabit houses, how do we want to live in houses. Going from the first funding period to the second, the focus of our research group, as has already been stated repeatedly, will be more on the relations of specific collectivities to collectivity on a larger scale. Susanne Beer, I think, said we are looking now from the smaller we's to the bigger we, the larger collectivity, maybe framed as common good. How and in which way can collectivities be driving forces in the renegotiation of the common good and solidarity? One of the questions I have in regard to this is whether individualized subjects with specific concerns are necessarily the starting point for understanding processes of collectivization. Are collectives best conceptualized as a sum of somewhat similar individuals? What is occluded or is invisible in that approach? How are formations of individuality conceivable starting from collectivity? Collectivity as the condition of possibility for individuality. And what does it mean when I started and said, now we have to differentiate and say what kind of collectivity? Does this bring us closer to an answer? If we look closer at what kind of collectivities are we talking about and what kind of individuality do they make possible or impossible? Finishing on this bundle of rather rough questions, I'd like to pass the microphone to you, Eddie, for your thoughts and reflections on collectivity, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Hanna, and thank you to the organizers for having me. This is really great to be able to have an interdisciplinary reflection on these concepts. So it was interesting for me to hear the adage that was offered up for critique by Martin Lücke, queer heißt niemals wir. And for me, the really highly contested term there is the wir, the we. And that sticks out even more than the queer for me, because I guess in reflecting on collectivity, my main question has been, what are the terms of being together? And how do we negotiate those terms when there are either value differences, so those differences that kind of go to the heart of the togetherness, or when there is an instrumentalization, maybe from law or from some external force, external to the collective, that basically puts parts of the collective against one another. And I'll just talk about that briefly, I think, in reflection on my thoughts on it. So in the work that I've been involved in, collectives can be characterized as configurations or constellations of people that aspire towards a set of defined political or social goals or ideas. And I've heard themes of that come up during this interdisciplinary session. And I think that's a good starting place, rather than to think about collectives as any constellation of people. Because I think while that, I'm sure, will be a part of the research group's total vision, just to focus my comments on collectivity as a particular form of being together, a particular project is quite helpful. So there's this set of ideas or this vision or this goal. But then there's also a sense in which there's mutual accountability and co-presence. So occupying the same space, whether that's a physical space or whether that's a conceptual space, and being committed to care within that space. And that is a mode of sharing, I think, that characterizes what I have seen as collectives, especially when the groups that I'm referring to call themselves collectives. That seems to be a common trend. And I think that resonates also with what Julia Eckert said, that commonality doesn't mean sameness, but it means a type of sharing. And I think that's part of it is sharing this vision, and sharing a space, or sharing some sort of commitment to care. But then beyond that, there's also the presumption of co-designing and democratizing participation. So in that sense, it's sharing power. So sharing a vision, sharing space, and sharing power seem to be characteristics that I've kind of seen from this type of constellation. And the quality then of togetherness is not value neutral. And so that raises the question of how to think about what happens when maybe some more of the crucial values that should be shared, when there are differences in those crucial values. So what are the terms of being together in that sense? One of the most prominent self-described collectives that I can think of from my work is the Movement for Black Lives, which developed in 2015 in the United States in parallel to the Black Lives Matter movement. And it is a collective of over 50 organizations that represents a range of Black communities and Black people in the United States. And it describes itself as a collective in much of the same way that another very, very famous collective described itself, in terms of being, having a flat hierarchy and being concerned with a range of interests, intersectional interests. And that much more famous example, and one that I think has set the tone, at least in spaces of activist spaces and social movement spaces in the US and in other places, is the Combahee River Collective, which wrote a very influential statement in 1977, which has been used in academia as well as in organizing. And the Cohambie River Collective was a Black lesbian feminist socialist organization that fought against interlocking systems of oppression. And it was explicitly not only for Black lesbians, but for others facing injustice. But because of the collective's remit, the production of its values and its terms of coalition building was authored by the Black lesbian socialist feminists that began the collective. So the range of ideas that they put forward in their opening statement don't necessarily define, all of the types of work of every collective, because this is really just a characterization of what collectives that I've come across have put forward as their main, the main aspects of their work. But they provided, or they described visionary political aims, long-term ones, pragmatic steps towards immediate political change, positioning their work as in coordination or solidarity with other groups who weren't self-identified Black lesbian socialist feminists, and setting the groundwork for future coalition building. So it was really trying to have both a historical view toward historical forms of oppression and a future view towards what the world should look like. And so this has set the tone for, I think, a lot of collectives that call themselves collectives working towards social change in the US. So just one or two quotes from the statement. They say, "We are a collective of Black feminists who have been meeting together since 1974. During that time, we have been involved in the process of defining and clarifying our politics, while at the same time doing political work within our own group and in coalition with other progressive organizations and movements." So there's that concept of progress, of course, because social change and social progress, I think, do kind of permeate the language of the collectives that I've looked at. Another quote in the statement is, "We are socialists because we believe that work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the products, and not for the profit of the bosses. Material resources must be equally distributed among those who create these resources." And then it goes on later to describe the flat hierarchy and power sharing within the organization. So I'll just note that there are some interesting continuities between the form of the collective and the substance of what they aim to address. And I think that also comes out with I think the idea of the collective being a space that wants to go beyond the organizing control of society. So I think in today's terms, writer or theorists and activists like Dean Spade, who is a trans legal scholar in the US, wrote a book called Normal Life, and there he describes the idea of a critical trans politics, and that's a politics that has the potential for articulating demands that go beyond neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is, it's the concept of the control, the organizing control that Spade points to. But elsewhere in the book, Dean Spade talks about other forms of control that a critical trans politics would supersede. Of course, one of those forms being the concept of gender. And just to wrap up with just a reflection on one of the things that Hanna raised, was a question: are individualized subjects with specific concerns necessarily the starting point for understanding the process of collectivization? And what does it occlude or or render invisible? And I think that's a really great question, because part of that question asks, how do we think about the relationship between all of the ways in which individuals can differ? So, and this is, I guess, back to that adage, queer heißt niemals wir. How can we think about difference and, to some extent, fundamental difference within collective work or within a collective, or the concept of collectivity? So for the organizations I've looked at, I think it probably is the case that they would make an argument that there's there's self-criticism built into the self-understanding of the organization, that there's room for those discussions of differences, that a flat hierarchy means that any members are able to constructively debate these things. But of course, there are a set of values. So one of the questions for me is there a way of thinking about the democracy of value production within collectives as something that's beyond simply, people who have similar ideas about things deciding that those are the values? That's a bit tautological, it's a bit circular, but it is a question of what are the terms of togetherness? What makes a collective different from a coalition, which has the connotation of being decidedly distinct groups or people with quite important differences that are building bridges rather than being in the same space and occupying the same visions. And of course, when I say same, I also build in some room for there to be difference. It's just that the question is how much difference makes a difference when we're thinking of collectives and collectivity. And from a slightly different angle, the issue that was raised by, to finish my thought on the question that was raised by Hanna, I think that specific concerns are best viewed not as exclusive concerns, or the specific concerns of individuals shouldn't be viewed as exclusive, but overlapping and interlocking, and sometimes in tension with those with which they're in collectives. So that needs to kind of be in place if we're to understand collectivity as not just being absolutely the same. But from a different angle, to bring in the comments by Eva Kocher and Julia Eckert, in particular, the change in law that Julia Eckert mentioned in going from perceiving difference as particularity and thus commonality to law kind of disturbing solidarities in new ways. I think of the work of Madhavi Sundar, for example, a legal scholar who has an article called Cultural Dissent. And it articulates it describes how certain rights-based debates can exacerbate the fragmentation of different groups, and how certain groups are, have internal debates that can then play themselves out in the legal context with, with available tools, which means that some of those arguments in that group turn into civil rights or rights based on equality concepts and equal protection. And then those that are borne out on the basis of cultural rights, or sometimes freedom of speech, or freedom of association. And that these types of legal debates can then turn, can instrumentalize difference in a certain way that I think demonstrates what I thought of, at least with Julia Eckert's comment. So just my questions, just to close, I probably haven't helped very much to bring the conversation forward with deciding what the terms are of togetherness. But what are the terms of accountability that members of collectives have to one another or declare to one another? And can a collective be also a coalition? So how do we think of the concept of togetherness as also being apart? How can we be together and apart, or share a vision, but then have differences on parts of that vision and still do collective work? So how do we accommodate differences in values beyond differences that might not affect that vision. So I'll leave it there and turn it back over to you, Hanna.
Thank you, Eddie. That was very thought-provoking, because I think, yes, for me, it brings the conversation forward. That's also progress, maybe. It brings the conversation forward. But I'd maybe put it a little differently. The question, what are the terms of togetherness? What for me brings the conversation forward is, I very much appreciate that you focus directly on the term of collective as a very specific form of collectivity. And you name some defining moments, like collectives are formed around marginalized issues or from marginalized positions, or from structurally marginalized positions, and they strive to be non-hierarchical and democratic in their decision making. So the question is, the terms of togetherness is more the qualities of togetherness that distinguish for me the collective from maybe other forms of collectivities like organizations or families or so on. So this is, I think this is something to think about also when we were grappling with new forms of collectivities. Are they collectives, and where do collectives come in? Collectives are old forms. I really appreciated that you spotlighted the Kamahi River Collective, because I think that offers an excellent response to my question whether individualized subjects with specific concerns are necessarily the starting point. I think this thinking back also to this Kamahi River Collective is a very apt reminder of the necessity to be aware of the geopolitical situatedness of knowledges and agencies, and also the questions we ask about collectivities and the view we have on collectivities. And it also complicates our claim that we are looking at the formation of new collectivities in late modern societies. So in which way are they new, and where are they taking up old traditions or old constellations, or also existing constellations of collectivity in their formation of, or in the reconfiguration of notions of common good, solidarity, and so on. And I think what is specific about the members of the Kamahi River Collective, they start from their individual situated experience of intersectional marginalization, which they analyze and understand in terms of structural effects and this form of subjectivity. And I think this is particular, this form of subjectivity cannot harbor the pretension of being a stakeholder in society as it is given. But they have to work on claims to the right and to the material possibilities to participate differently in and that means in a different society ultimately. I think it's not, they said they were socialist and feminist and collective. And I think this is important. They were talking about participating differently and thinking about. So I think if we had more time, I'd really like to go into a lot of deeper discussions with you and also with the other panelists here. But for now, I'd maybe like to just hand back to you for some closing remarks that you might have. And what I've also found interesting was your remark, or a question I would have to you is, how do you see the relation of collectives and coalitions? And can coalitions also be collectives? That's what I understood from your phrasing, that you can also see a coalition as a collective. So.
Thank you. And these questions are ones that I haven't had the kind of the space to think about, I don't think. Because on one hand, I think that a lot of those who are in collectives that identify themselves as collectives are not necessarily trying to distinguish between collectives and coalitions, because they're building coalitions as collectives, and it just seems like they're enacting it in a certain way. But when you read the statements, they're actually theorizing these concepts. So I think it's just something I've paid little attention to. But it seems that that the idea of the coalition as it's presented, whether it's in the Movement for Black Lives Collective statement, or which you can read online, or the Cohambie River collective statement, there's a caution and I think a type of humbleness. I'm thinking of Elisabeth's term, the humbleness of saying, you know, we don't have identical stories to other groups that are out there fighting for something, but we can find some common ground. And I think that type of approach, like you mentioned, is something that it's quite specific. It's, you know, it's an orientation around understanding the structural dimensions of marginalization and the possibilities for finding common ground if there's some sort of shared vision. And it's actually precisely what Dean Spade in another book recently wrote called Mutual Aid. And that is the concept that, you know, that groups who are fighting for social change or social justice should be able to identify the material needs of other groups and assist where they can, because that type of coalition building and assistance is the foundation of a broader sense of solidarity. But I guess, would we call that, we might call that collective work and collectivity, some form of being together. And I guess my narrow view of what a collective is kind of within that. So there's a little bit of a doubling of the language, because in some way we can't deny that that's collective work towards something. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think, thank you for those comments about a lot of these projects being geopolitically situated and having a sense that while there are new forms and new articulations of these things, that there's also a lineage of some of these ideas, and how those lineages are connected up for certain groups that are calling themselves collectives in these contexts that I mentioned.
Thank you so much, Eddie. I don't think we will come up with answers here, but we've come up with a lot of questions that I think and a lot of them we will be taking over into our new research phase. I'm very certain, and I'm very happy about that. And yes, we are very much at the end of our session of interdisciplinary gleanings, as I see right now. I'd like to thank all of our guests for coming here today, for discussing with us, and for giving us inspiring and stimulating thoughts that we will have so much to work on in future discussions in our research group. And I'd like to remind everybody that you're very welcome to join us on Wonder for further discussions, because as I said, we have more questions than answers right now, and we can carry on a bit on Wonder. But now I'd hand over to Beate Binder and Sabine Haag for the closing comments.